All right, so are you ready to dive deep? Because today we're unlocking like this treasure chest of lore
Elves, dwarves, and all those fascinating beings we think we know.
from fantasy novels and games.
But here's the thing, their history goes way beyond, dragons and
We're
dungeons,
talking ancient myths, hidden meanings.
and maybe even a glimpse into our own anxieties today.
Luckily, I've got an expert along for the ride who can shed some light on all this.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Welcome.
And you're absolutely right. These creatures have a history that stretches back centuries.
Weaving its way through various cultures and belief systems.
Okay, so when I think elves and dwarves, my brain goes straight to Tolkien.
But you're telling me they're not just his creations?
Not at all.
Tolkien drew inspiration from a rich tapestry of mythology.
Particularly from ancient Indo-European traditions.
Which, by the way, encompassed a huge swath of cultures across Europe and Asia.
In these myths, elves and dwarves often acted as intermediaries between the human world.
And the supernatural.
Intermediaries, so like mystical diplomats or something.
Exactly.
They were seen as bridges to the unseen realms.
Embodying the mysteries and powers of the natural world.
Okay.
But here's where it gets really interesting.
This bridge status also gave them a certain ambiguity.
They could be helpful associated with fertility healing, even protection.
But cross them, and you might find yourself on the receiving end of some very bad luck.
Ooh, that unpredictable side is kind of what I love about these figures.
Like you never know if they're going to help you bake bread or curse your entire bloodline.
Precisely.
And that duality, that potential for both good and ill, is a recurring theme.
Take the concept of elf shot, for instance.
Wait, like actually being shot with an arrow by an elf.
Not quite a physical arrow.
But rather a sudden illness or misfortune blamed on invisible elf magic.
It was a way of explaining the unexplainable.
Acknowledging the existence of unseen forces that could impact your life for better or worse.
You know, my grandma always blamed a draft for my earaches, but maybe it was those pesky elves all along.
But seriously, that's fascinating how these beliefs reflect a kind of primal fear of the unknown.
Absolutely.
And it wasn't just limited to general notions of elves or dwarves.
Often specific beings were venerated or feared based on their names.
Names. So it's not just about Thor and Odin, it's about, like, Steve the elf.
Well, not quite, Steve.
But you get the idea.
Imagine finding a village named after a specific type of elf.
Or uncovering ancient inscriptions that mention offerings made to a dwarf associated with a particular mountain.
Those names are like breadcrumbs leading us back to entire belief systems that revolved around these figures.
It's like archaeology, but for folklore.
That's incredible.
I'm never going to look at a name in a fantasy novel the same way again.
Okay, so we've touched on the mysterious, sometimes menacing world of elves.
But what about dwarves? They always seem to get relegated to the bearded blacksmiths who love gold stereotype.
It's true, they often get typecast.
But their significance runs much deeper than that.
Think about it. Who forged Thor's hammer Mjolnir?
Dwarves, right?
I'm guessing there's a story there.
Oh, there's always a story.
And it highlights the dwarves' unique role as masters of the Earth's depths.
They weren't just skilled craftspeople.
They were believed to possess a deep understanding of the Earth's secrets.
Able to tap into its power to create objects of immense magic and strength.
Okay, that's pretty darn cool.
But you mentioned something earlier about duality.
Does that apply to dwarves, too? They seem pretty grounded, literally.
That's the fascinating thing.
They embody that duality perfectly.
On one hand, they represent the Earth's bounty.
The riches of mines, the potential for creation.
But on the other hand, they also represent the hidden, sometimes ominous aspects of the Earth.
Remember, they often dwell in darkness, guarding their secrets closely.
Right.
Think about it this way. You don't get diamonds without digging deep, right?
But sometimes what you find in the dark can be pretty unsettling.
Ooh, I like where you're going with this.
So we have these complex, powerful beings integrated into ancient belief systems.
But what happened when Christianity entered the picture?
It seems like there might have been a bit of a clash of beliefs.
It definitely wasn't a seamless transition you see with the rise of Christianity.
A lot of those older belief systems, especially the ones involving
A multitude of spirits or beings with ambiguous powers.
well, they were seen as a challenge to the church's authority.
So instead of just adding saints to the mix, it was more like out with the old gods and everybody who hung out with them too.
In a nutshell, yes.
There was a concerted effort to reframe those older beliefs.
Those figures who had once been revered or feared.
That's dangerous, even demonic.
So not just outdated, but actually dangerous. That's quite a
Do
shift.
you have any examples of how that played out in the folklore?
Well, take the figure of the leprechaun, for instance.
In older Irish folklore, they were mischievous tricksters.
Sure, but not inherently evil.
But with the spread of Christianity, some stories began to associate them with demonic forces.
Turning them into cautionary tales about the dangers of dealing with magical beings.
Right.
It's like these figures got caught in the crossfire of a cultural shift.
Wow, talk about a PR nightmare for the poor leprechauns. But if they were so demonized, how is it that we're still talking about elves and dwarves today?
I mean, they obviously didn't vanish from our stories.
That's the incredible thing about folklore.
It has this amazing ability to adapt and survive.
Even when the church tried to suppress those older beliefs, the stories themselves lived on.
Passed down orally, woven into the fabric of everyday life.
So it's like those whispered tales by the fireside, the ones that your grandparents tell you and warn you not to repeat.
But you do anyway.
Exactly.
And in those retellings, the elves and dwarves might have been stripped of some of their former glory.
They're connections to the old gods, but they retained a certain mystique.
Okay.
They became less about specific deities and more about representing something fundamental in the human experience.
Okay, I'm seeing it now, like those stories about dwarves being master craftspeople hoarding treasure in mountains.
Those themes still resonate with us, even if we don't necessarily believe in dwarves literally living under our floorboards. Those core elements, the connection to nature, the allure of hidden knowledge.
The fascination with creation and craftsmanship.
Right.
Those ideas have a timeless quality. They speak to something deep within us.
Regardless of our belief systems.
It's kind of beautiful, actually, how these figures have endured through centuries of change, taking on new meanings along the way.
Speaking of enduring, we can't forget about the massive impact they've had on modern fantasy.
I mean, Tolkien practically wrote the encyclopedia on elves and dwarves, right?
Tolkien's influence is undeniable.
But it's important to remember that he wasn't creating in a vacuum.
He drew heavily on that vast wellspring of mythology and folklore.
Those archetypes that have been passed down through generations.
What he did so brilliantly was to adapt them, to give them his own unique spin while staying true to their essence.
When you say adapt, what do you mean exactly? Did he give them all tiny hats and a fondness for riddles?
Not quite.
One of the key things Tolkien did was to shift the moral compass of these figures.
In older stories, elves and dwarves were often morally ambiguous.
Capable of great kindness and great cruelty,
Right.
but Tolkien tended to present them in a more heroic light, their motivations more aligned with good versus evil.
Now that you mention it, even when Tolkien's dwarves are being grumpy or greedy, they're usually on the right side of the bigger fight.
And the elves are practically angelic.
That's a crucial distinction.
He drew inspiration from the complexities of the old tales, but imbued his characters with a clearer sense of purpose.
Aligning them more firmly with the forces of good.
Right.
It's one of the reasons his works resonate so strongly with readers.
We connect with those heroic journeys even when they're set in fantastical worlds.
It makes you wonder, though, how those portrayals might change again as we move further into the future.
We're living in a world grappling with climate change technological advancements that feel almost magical and a constant sense of information overload.
If elves and dwarves are reflections of our own anxieties, our relationship with nature and the unknown,
How might those anxieties shape the way we see them today?
it's like we've gone from worrying about elves, cursing our cattle.
To worrying about if we're ruining their forests with our smartphones.
It's a fascinating parallel, isn't it?
And it speaks to the enduring power of these archetypes.
Right.
They evolve alongside us, reflecting our changing relationship with the world around us.
Think about it if dwarves were traditionally tied to the Earth's bounty.
What happens in a world grappling with resource depletion?
Right.
Do they become guardians of what's left, fiercely protective of the remaining treasures?
Or do they find new ways to adapt, maybe seeking knowledge in technology instead of just mining for ore?
And with elves, it's not just about the physical environment, right?
It's about that sense of wonder, of magic that we associate with them.
Does our increasing reliance on technology, on having a logical explanation for everything?
Does that somehow diminish the elves? Or make them even more mysterious, more otherworldly?
It's a question worth pondering.
Perhaps in our stories, elves retreat further into the shadows, guardians of the last vestiges of magic, in a world that's lost its sense of enchantment.
Or maybe they find ways to bridge the gap, using their ancient wisdom to guide us.
Toward a healthier relationship with technology and the natural world. It's
Yeah.
like those fantasy novels where the elves show up just when all hope seems lost.
Offering a solution no one else could have imagined.
Okay, my mind is officially blown.
I'm never going to look at a fantasy novel, a game, even a garden gnome the same way again.
Seriously, this deep dive has been incredible. I feel like I've gained a whole new appreciation.
For these creatures, for the stories they tell us about ourselves.
That's the beauty of exploring folklore and mythology.
It's a journey of discovery, not just about ancient beliefs,
Right.
but about what those beliefs reveal about the human condition.
So for anyone listening who's now just as hooked on this stuff as I am,
What's like the most important thing to remember?
what's the key takeaway here?
I'd say it's this. Don't underestimate the power of stories.
Elves, dwarves, these figures aren't just figments of our imagination.
They're reflections of our deepest fears, our aspirations, our evolving relationship with the unknown.
Okay.
The next time you encounter one in a book, a game, or even just a fleeting thought,
Take a moment to consider what they might represent.
you might be surprised by what you discover.
Consider that a challenge, listeners.
And on that note, we'll be leaving you to ponder the mysteries and the magic that lurk.
Just beneath the surface of our stories. Until next time, keep exploring.